Hello, what time is it where you are right now? Type the hour in the comments.
They say people don't remember speeches, just how you made them feel. But trust me, no one in that room will forget what my father said that night. And even fewer will forget what I did right after. The banquet hall was filled with the low hum of forks against china, cheap jazz piped through overhead speakers, and the occasional awkward chuckle between coworkers who clearly never talked outside work. I stood near the back, nursing a glass of overpriced Chardonnay, listening to my father wax poetic about honor, duty, and tradition. His favorite trio of words, right after "Did Eli tell you about his new promotion?" It was his retirement dinner, a celebration of 42 years in the defense contracting industry. People called him a warhorse, a patriot, a man of principle. He always wore his suits stiff, like they'd been starched with pride. And as he took the mic that night, he looked every bit the hero people believed he was. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his back straight, his chest puffed out as if the American flag had just been ironed onto it. "I've given everything I had to this work," he said, his voice carrying across the room with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged. "And through it all, I've leaned on my family, my wife, my children, my son Eli." He paused, eyes glistening just enough to seem real. "Eli has been my rock, my mirror, my legacy. I'm so grateful for him. He's the one who'll carry our name with honor." Applause erupted. A few people stood. My mom dabbed at the corner of her eyes like it was the Oscars. Eli looked embarrassed in that humble brag kind of way that made you want to slap the smug off his face. I just smiled, not a wide smile. More like the smile you give someone who just told you your house burned down, but hey, at least the driveway's intact. I waited until the applause died down, until people started sipping again, relaxing into their chairs, plates cleared. I walked up to the podium like I belonged there, folder tucked neatly under my arm. "Dad," I said, my voice smooth as silk wrapped around a blade. "That was beautiful, truly." He looked at me, surprised. We hadn't spoken in 3 months, not since I declined his offer to assist at Eli's company, basically babysitting his golden child's vanity project. "I didn't know you were going to speak," he said, chuckling awkwardly, adjusting the mic stand like it was a shield. "I wasn't," I replied. "But after that touching tribute, I figured now's as good a time as any." I turned to the crowd, most of whom only knew me as the daughter who moved to DC and does something with nonprofits. I saw polite smiles and mildly interested expressions. Everyone here knows my father as a man of duty, of honor, a man who built his career, his name, his whole identity around legacy, which is why this, I opened the folder and held up the first page, might come as a bit of a shock. My dad squinted. My mom looked confused. Eli reached for a glass of water like suddenly his throat was dry. "This is a legal notice," I continued, confirming the finalization of my name change. "Effective last month, I am no longer Jenna Dawson." A murmur rippled through the room. My father laughed, trying to recover. "Come on, Jenna, what are you talking about? Is this some kind of joke?" "Strange, isn't it?" I said, stepping closer and handing him the folder. "Because this says otherwise." He took it, flipping through the pages. His face turned gray before my eyes, his expression crumbling like an old statue chipped at just the right spot. He read the first line, "Petition for legal name change, Jenna Claire Hart." He looked up at me like I'd stabbed him with the flagpole he carried around in his soul. "You changed your name?" he whispered, but not low enough. A few people gasped. My aunt dropped her wine glass. "I did," I said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Because this name, this family name, it never belonged to me." Silence filled the room like smoke, thick, suffocating. People weren't sure whether to look at him, me, or their empty dessert plates. I grew up being told to be quiet when Eli talked. Told to support, not lead. Told to be proud of a name that never once stood for me. "You spent your whole life pretending I was some side character in a story about your greatness, so I decided to write my own." His hands trembled. Whether from anger or shame, I didn't care. And just so we're all clear, I added, tapping the folder gently, this isn't about erasing anything. It's about claiming something, my own identity, my own values, my own damn story. A few people clapped, nervously, like they didn't know whose side to be on. Eli stood frozen, half between his chair and the dessert table. Mom just stared at me, her face unreadable. Anyway, I said, turning back to the crowd, please enjoy your dessert. I hear the lemon meringue is excellent. I walked off the stage as if I'd never lived under that man's name. In a way, I hadn't, not really. I'd just been wearing it like a coat 3 sizes too big, stitched with expectations I never asked to carry. And as I reached the hallway and pushed through the doors into the warm night air, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of silence behind me, heavy, uncertain, and long overdue. The morning after the dinner, I woke up not to the sound of my phone ringing or messages flooding in, but to the kind of stillness that usually comes right before a thunderstorm. The kind of quiet that tells you the damage is already done, and now everyone's just figuring out how to clean up without getting their hands dirty. The only text I had was from my mom. Call me when you can, please. No punctuation, which somehow made it worse. I didn't respond. Not because I was trying to be cold, but because I'd spent too many years responding right away, smoothing things over, playing the dependable daughter while everything around me cracked and tilted, just enough to keep me off balance. It's a strange thing, growing up in a house where love feels conditional, where praise is handed out like coupons, and always seems to expire before you get a chance to use it. For as long as I can remember, I was the support beam, not the centerpiece. The one who held the room together so Eli could shine. The one who got told, "You're so mature for your age," which really meant, "Thanks for not being a problem like your brother." When I was 7, Eli flooded the upstairs bathroom by shoving half a roll of paper towels down the toilet. I got scolded for not watching him closely enough. At 13, I got straight A's and perfect attendance, and my dad barely glanced at my report card before asking if I could help Eli write a book report he'd forgotten about. By the time I hit high school, I stopped expecting applause. Not because I didn't think I deserved it, but because I had learned exactly how the system worked. Eli made mistakes, and I cleaned them up. Eli got into trouble, and I smoothed things over. Eli was a sparkler, short-lived, flashy, impossible to ignore. I was the emergency flashlight in the junk drawer. Reliable, unseen, taken for granted until the power went out. I remember the day I told my dad I'd gotten into Georgetown. He was sitting at the kitchen table, reading the Sunday paper like he did every weekend. I stood in front of him, letter in hand, heart pounding like it had its own drumline. "Full ride," I said, barely able to keep the excitement out of my voice. "Public policy." He didn't even lower the paper, just said, "That's a lot of student protests and red tape. You sure that's what you want to spend your time on?" That was it. No congratulations, no dinner out, not even a smile. Just the faint rustle of newspaper pages and the invisible wall between us growing an inch thicker. Meanwhile, when Eli announced he was joining Dad's company, no degree, no plan, just vibes. They threw him a barbecue, had banners made, got t-shirts with the company logo and Next Gen Leadership printed across the back. I remember watching him pose for pictures, beer in hand, arms slung around Dad's shoulder, both of them beaming like they'd just discovered electricity. So no, I didn't wake up the next morning after the dinner full of regret or guilt or whatever they were probably hoping for. I felt like I had finally shut the door on a house where I'd been kept in the attic all my life. What surprised me wasn't how free I felt, but how quickly the freedom turned into curiosity. Because I hadn't planned the speech. I hadn't meant to pull out that folder in front of everyone. But the folder itself? That had been with me for almost a year. It started with a plain white envelope, no return address, postmarked from Texas. I thought it was junk mail at first, until I opened it and found a photograph and 2 photocopied documents. The photo showed a young woman, maybe in her 20s, standing beside a mailbox with a toddler on her hip. Behind them, a 1-story ranch house with peeling paint and a battered American flag fluttering in the background. At the bottom of the photo, in faded ink, Claire, 1990. The documents were court transcripts, specifically a child support hearing. I scanned the pages, confused at first, until I saw the name, Henry Dawson, my father. One sentence was highlighted in yellow. The defendant, Henry Dawson, acknowledged paternity under oath. I stared at that line for nearly 5 minutes, blinking like it might change if I looked hard enough. But it didn't. It just sat there, bold and indifferent, telling me that the man who had spent his life policing the idea of family, who talked about bloodlines like they were sacred rivers, had a daughter he never mentioned. A daughter born before he married my mother. A daughter who existed completely outside of the story he liked to tell at parties and board meetings. I didn't tell anyone, not at first. I tucked the envelope into a lockbox under my bed and left it there, like a grenade I wasn't ready to pull the pin on. But it changed something in me. It was like discovering a crack in a dam you'd always been told was solid. You start to notice the leaks. You start to listen more closely to the silences. Over the next few months, I started digging, not obsessively, but intentionally. I traced the court records, searched databases, and finally found a name, Claire Delaney. She was living in a small town outside Austin. No criminal record, no lawsuits, just a ghost. Like someone had wanted to make sure she was never more than a footnote. Meanwhile, my father continued parading Eli around like a trophy son, the last Dawson standing, the future of the name. That's when it started to make sense. The toast, the folder, the timing. I hadn't planned to burn the house down, but once I saw how dry the timber was, all it took was a match. As I sat on my porch that morning, the envelope back in my hands, I thought about what it meant to be part of a legacy. People think legacy is about pride, about honor, but sometimes it's just about who gets left out of the story, and I was tired of being written in pencil. The first time I saw Claire in person, I couldn't stop staring at her hands. They were almost identical to mine. Same long fingers, same chipped pinky nail on the left, same way the veins ran like blue rivers beneath the skin. She noticed it too. She laughed, and the sound was tired, like she'd already run out of energy for being surprised. "Well," she said, reaching for her coffee. "Guess it's true what they say about blood." We met at a diner off I-35, the kind of place that smelled like bacon grease and floor cleaner no matter what time of day it was. She'd agreed to see me after I sent her a letter. Handwritten, because somehow an email felt like it would cheapen the whole thing. I didn't tell her everything, just enough to open the door. She wrote back a week later. "I always knew there was someone else. I just didn't expect it to be you." She looked nothing like Eli. Thank God. Her hair was lighter than mine, and her eyes were a soft hazel that made you think of late autumn. She had a quiet way about her, like someone who'd long since stopped trying to take up space in rooms that didn't want her. Everything about her said she'd learned how to protect herself by staying small, and I hated how familiar that felt. But what really got me wasn't her face or her voice. It was how easy it was to talk to her, like we'd already lived through the same war, just on opposite sides of the battlefield. She told me about her mother, a woman named Janet, who worked 2 jobs most of her life and who died before she turned 60. "My mom was strong," Claire said, looking out the window. But she never stopped being angry, not just at him, at herself too. She believed him when he said he'd come back. I didn't know what to say to that, because what do you say when you realize the man who made you feel invisible once did the same thing to someone else, but even worse? I'd been denied love. She'd been denied acknowledgement. There's a difference, and hers cut deeper. As the hours passed, pieces began to fit together. Turns out Eli had known about Claire for over a year. He'd found her by accident, through some half-assed ancestry site he'd joined for fun, the kind of thing he probably did after a few beers with friends just to see if he had Viking blood. When a match popped up labeled half-sibling, he didn't tell anyone, not me, not our parents, not even Claire. He just started watching, following her online, creeping around the edges of her life like a ghost with a grudge. Eventually he reached out. Sent her a message asking if she wanted to talk about their father. She said he seemed nervous, charming in a cheap cologne kind of way, like someone who's used to getting out of trouble with a smile and a shrug. He never followed up, just disappeared. She figured maybe he got scared. I knew better. See, Eli doesn't do scared. He does consequences. He does what's easiest right now. So the fact that he had this information, that he'd kept it quiet while standing next to Dad, every time he gave one of those legacy-laced speeches, made my skin crawl. It wasn't just cowardice, it was strategy. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a personal betrayal, but something deeper, something financial. That's when I went back through the records, company filings, tax documents, campaign contributions, all the dull paper trails people think are boring until they start asking the right questions. And sure enough, there it was, small but consistent transfers from one of Dad's corporate accounts to a consultancy based in Austin, a shell company registered under a name I didn't recognize, until I cross-referenced the address and found that it was listed on a car registration belonging to, you guessed it, Eli. The man who was supposed to carry our name with honor had been skimming off the top, funneling funds through dummy accounts, and covering his tracks with just enough effort to avoid scrutiny, but not enough to hide from someone who knew what to look for. What's worse, he'd used Claire's name as a cover in one of the transfers, likely thinking it would bury the lead. After all, who would think to investigate a forgotten daughter from another life? I felt sick, not because of the money, but because it was so calculated. He had turned her existence into a firewall, a decoy, something to keep eyes off himself, as if she was just another chess piece on a board he thought he controlled. And all this time, I'd been the one expected to be quiet, grateful, obedient, the good daughter, the helper. I didn't tell Claire everything right away. There was too much to sort out, too much I didn't want to taint with numbers and legal jargon. But I did tell her one thing before we parted ways that night, as we stood in the parking lot beneath a flickering neon sign. "You're not alone anymore," I said, my voice low. "You never should have been." She smiled, a soft thing that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Neither should you." On the drive back, I thought about Eli, about how he'd smiled during that retirement toast, clapped the loudest, poured our dad scotch like he was anointing himself. I thought about all the years I spent covering for him, believing that maybe one day he'd change, maybe one day he'd step up. But now I saw him for what he really was, not the heir, not the legacy, just a man playing dress-up with other people's power. He wasn't my brother, not anymore. Maybe he never had been. I didn't choose him. I never would have. But I could choose what came next, and I was just getting started. I used to think revenge had to be loud to mean something, that it had to come crashing down like a wrecking ball or scream through the room like a siren. But there's a different kind of revenge, a quieter kind, the kind that doesn't announce itself in fire, but instead moves slowly, slipping under doors and into cracks, taking its time to rot the foundation before anyone realizes the whole damn house is about to fall. That's the kind I wanted, the kind that makes the walls groan before they break. After I left Claire in Austin, something shifted in me. It wasn't anger, though there was plenty of that. It was something cleaner, sharper, a kind of clarity that had been trying to claw its way to the surface for years, but kept getting shoved back down by habit, guilt, and the constant, crushing demand to be the better person. But better for who? For a man who couldn't even say my name without following it with a sigh? For a family who valued loyalty more than truth, as long as it was aimed in the right direction? I didn't owe them silence anymore. The first step was my name. I filed the paperwork, paid the fees, and signed every form with the kind of deliberate satisfaction most people save for burning old love letters or quitting jobs they hate. Jenna Claire Hart. The middle name wasn't just for me. It was for her, for Claire, for the sister I never knew I had until she showed me what kind of man our father really was. I figured if I couldn't rewrite the past, the least I could do was drag it into the light and give it a proper name. The second step was more delicate. While Dad was still basking in the afterglow of his retirement party, accepting calls, posting staged photos, sending emails full of pride and next chapter platitudes. I was building a case. Nothing flashy, nothing illegal, just facts. I combed through public records, vendor contracts, billing discrepancies, and flagged line items that never quite added up. With Sam's help, my best friend and quietly ruthless legal mentor, I gathered just enough to catch the interest of some very serious people who had very little patience for people like my father. There's a certain irony in taking down a man who spent his entire life talking about duty and honor by using the very rules he pretended to live by. It's like handing a preacher his own sermon and watching him choke on the words. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not Mom, not even Claire. I wanted it airtight. I wanted the truth to do the talking, not the emotions. Besides, this wasn't about emotional catharsis. It was about accountability, about balance, about letting the universe know that sometimes even the most deeply buried lies eventually run out of breath. Then came the conversation with Mom. I hadn't planned to tell her anything, not until everything was in motion, but something about the way she kept texting me, short messages that felt like unfinished thoughts, made me drive to her house one evening without warning. She answered the door in a robe, eyes tired, mascara smudged from a long day, pretending not to notice how her husband's silence had turned heavy again. The house looked exactly the same, down to the framed photo in the entryway of Eli at his college graduation, which he barely earned and left 6 months later anyway. We sat in the kitchen. I told her everything, from the name change to the documents to Claire. I laid it all out like evidence on a courtroom table, and when I was done, I waited. She didn't cry, she didn't yell. She just looked older than I'd ever seen her, like something in her spine had given up trying to stand straight. I knew about Claire, she said after a long stretch of silence. I found the paperwork one day, years ago, before you were born. He told me it was nothing, that she was just a mistake. My stomach turned. And you stayed? I had 2 kids, she replied, not looking at me. I had a life, and I believed him when he said it was behind him. What was I supposed to do, start over, alone? The answer screamed in my head. Yes. You were supposed to choose dignity. You were supposed to choose truth. You were supposed to choose us, but I said none of that. I just nodded because I finally understood that some people wear their regret like armor, and taking it away would only leave them naked and afraid. She begged me not to go public. She said it would ruin everything, Dad's reputation, Eli's job, the family's name. And I told her the truth, plain and calm. Everything's already ruined. I'm just turning the lights on so we can see it. I left that night feeling something close to peace, not because we'd reconciled, but because I'd stopped needing to. Sometimes closure isn't a door swinging shut. Sometimes it's realizing you've already walked through it and just didn't notice until you looked back and saw the house was burning. A few days later, I got the text from Sam. The contracts you flagged? FBI opened an investigation this morning. I stared at that message for a long time. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was happening. For the first time in my life, something was finally happening on my terms. I wasn't reacting. I wasn't cleaning up a mess I didn't make. I was the one who lit the fuse. My father still hadn't called. Maybe he was waiting for me to crawl back, to explain myself, to apologize. But the only thing I regretted was not doing it sooner. And Eli, he was quieter than usual. His social media unusually empty, no more rooftop selfies or blurry shots of steak dinners, captioned with empty hustle culture quotes. Maybe he'd felt the tremor. Maybe he knew the ground was shifting under him. Either way, it didn't matter, because the legacy my father had tried to build was crumbling, and I wasn't going to lift a single finger to save it. I was too busy building something of my own, something without his name on it, something that didn't need a speech to prove it mattered. By the time the fallout finally reached the surface, there wasn't a single person left in my father's circle who could pretend they hadn't seen the cracks forming years ago. It was as if the entire world had been balancing on a house of cards. each one printed with a different version of his truth, and all it took was a single gust of consequence to send it collapsing inward with a soundless thud that somehow echoed for miles. The news broke quietly, in the way most real scandals do, not with a dramatic exposé or a television special, but with a few understated headlines buried beneath louder distractions, and yet the right people noticed. The people he built his reputation on impressing. His donors, his investors, the people who shook his hand like it was made of gold, all began to pull away like water from a cracked glass, slow at first, then all at once, until there was nothing left holding it all together. The FBI investigation didn't lead to an arrest, at least not immediately, but it did trigger a series of internal audits, corporate freezes, and early retirements that left his once proud company looking more like a deflated balloon than the legacy-driven machine he always bragged about. Eli, unsurprisingly, disappeared from the public eye in record time, deleting profiles, shutting down his so-called consulting group, and retreating into the shadows like the coward I always knew he was, the kind who only ever showed up when there was something to gain and vanished the moment consequences came knocking. My mother stopped calling after that. There wasn't a fight, no final argument or tearful goodbye, just silence. A long, stretching silence that felt strangely comfortable, like finally removing a shoe you never realized had been a size too small. Your entire life. I had already mourned that relationship, already buried it beneath layers of resignation and quiet sadness. So when it went cold, all I felt was a kind of numb relief, the kind that comes when you finally let go of the weight you were never meant to carry in the first place. Claire, on the other hand, stayed. Not in my physical space. Our lives were still too different, too carefully built apart. But in my world, we talked regularly, sometimes late at night when the guilt hit her harder than usual. She carried more of it than I expected, always wondering if her reappearance had caused the whole collapse. I told her the truth, again and again. She didn't break anything. She just arrived in time to help me recognize the wreckage for what it had always been. And every time I said that, I believed it more deeply. The nonprofit I co-founded years earlier, the one I'd quietly nurtured while my father talked about real business, finally came into the spotlight in a way I hadn't anticipated. It had been growing steadily, slowly gathering momentum through grant writing, grassroots connections, and stubborn, unpaid hours. But now, without the shadow of my father's name looming over me, it began to evolve into something much larger. There was a grant opportunity, one I had been too afraid to apply for under the Dawson name. And now, with heart behind me and a team who believed in what we were building, we went for it. And we won. The funding allowed us to open our first community center, a place dedicated to supporting women and children impacted by familial abuse, neglect, and generational trauma. The irony didn't escape me. My father had spent decades building tools of war, and now I was building sanctuaries for peace. Not because I wanted to spite him, but because it was the most honest rebellion I could imagine, creating healing where he had built hurt. The dedication ceremony was small, but meaningful. The building was modest, a converted library on the corner of a quiet neighborhood, but it was ours. On the day of the unveiling, I wore a deep navy suit and no makeup, not because I wanted to make a statement, but because I didn't feel the need to wear anything that wasn't entirely mine anymore. I stood on the small platform beside the board of directors, the mayor, and a handful of women who had contributed more than I ever could. And I waited until the tarp fell from the sign. There it was, the Hart Foundation Center for Restoration and Renewal. Underneath that, in smaller letters, founded by Jenna Claire Hart. There were no spotlights, no photographers, no family members pretending to cry. Just a slow, quiet round of applause from people who understood what that name meant, even if they didn't know the whole story. But I knew, Claire knew, and that was enough. After the crowd dispersed, I stood alone in front of the building, letting the late afternoon sun warm the side of my face. I reached into my bag and pulled out a letter, creased at the corners, yellowing at the fold. It was from my father, never mailed, postmarked from a month after the retirement party. I had found it tucked inside a book he once gave me, probably placed there during one of those brief moments when he thought I might come back around. It read, "Jenna, I didn't raise you to do this. I don't know what you're trying to prove, but this wasn't necessary. You've always been smart, but you don't understand the weight of what you've done. One day I hope you'll regret it." There was no signature, just that closing sentence, sitting like a stone at the bottom of the page. I folded the letter once more, slipped it back into my bag, and let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding, because that was the difference between him and me. He didn't raise me to do this, but that's exactly why I did. I turned away from the building, and as I walked back to the street, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel victorious. I felt whole, a word I hadn't used to describe myself since I was too young to know what it meant to be divided. There was still so much I didn't know, still gaps in the story that would never be filled, conversations that would never happen, and apologies that would never come. But I had stopped needing answers from people who couldn't tell the truth even if they wanted to. I had learned to ask better questions. I had learned to listen more closely to myself. And if my name was ever written on a wall again, it would be because I put it there, with my own hands, in my own time, without waiting for anyone else to give me permission.